I have a question about this idea that, and this is the one thing I keep getting stuck on with your teachings, the idea that you say life is a happening according to God's will. So uh, I've been wanting to believe, my whole life, I've been wanting to believe that God is all good. So when you say
Mhm.
that, it makes me question that idea. And, and then you look at the big, things that have happened in life and in society, like the Holocaust, etc. I have a hard time believing that that's God's will. Can you talk about
Mhm.
that? I'll just leave it there. Can you talk about that?
Yeah. So my one of the things that we tend to be a bit not very good at is recognizing that words have a specific definition attached to them. They're not the definition in the dictionary, but our own attributed definition to a word. And sometimes that definition is what you'll find in a dictionary. And sometimes we have the wrong definition on a word, so we mistake what a word means. But once we attach a definition to a word, as far as we're concerned, that word means what the definition that we have of the word is. Um, and just even exploring language is something we're not so good at. I guess we haven't really been um, taught that there are these layers. And so words, we learn them when we're young as a very automatic thing. And so a word seems to have a definition that is unchangeable until we start realizing that there is a definition and I can change the definition. And so often, if someone's talking to me using a certain word, or if I use a certain word, consciousness or whatever, then whoever's hearing it is going to hear what I'm saying according to their definitions of the word. Now, if we start listening to what's said and listen to the context, listen to how it's repeated many times, and start to conclude what definition the person speaking must have about that word, then we can say, oh, there's a um, there's a change happening in the way we are listening to words and the way we're processing words, what have you. And God is one of these words that's very loaded. So not only is there a definition, but it's a definition that usually is very loaded. Either people have a very strong affinity with the word God, or they've got a very strong resistance to the word God because of essentially how the word God has been used by their family or for themselves, whether it's delivered pleasure or pain to them, believing in a God or accepting the notion of God. So a lot of people feel very guilty, have been made to feel very guilty because of the notion of God. God's going to punish you for being a bad child or whatever. If you're bad, God will when you die, you'll have, eternal damnation. Or vice versa. God can be a concept that we feel very connected to. So that's a long preface to the answer, which is in my use of the word God, what I mean is not a God that most people have an image of, which is a very specific God, whatever that happens to be for them, but rather God as consciousness or energy, creative energy, creativity. So impersonal, it's not a person, not an entity that thinks and says, oh, I like that person, I don't like that person, I'm going to punish that person. Not one of those entities, but rather energy of some sort, creative energy that becomes all of the trees, all of the seas, all of the people, all of the thoughts, all of the habits, all of the the events and the consequences, the deeds and the consequences. And so it's not, this notion of God being benevolent is not the notion that I have. God is impersonal and has become the story of life. And God, even when I say God's will, it implies God that has a will, and God that is asserting its will, God that has cognized this world a certain way. Whereas God's will to me means God has turned into, God energy has turned into this, and whatever this is by default what I'm calling the will of energy manifesting. And so even saying the will in this context, we have to understand it doesn't mean some entity with free will or volition, which is how the word will is usually used. It simply means energy turned into all there is, and therefore in each moment, whatever there is energy manifest, which I'm calling God's will. And really the importance of that is it's not my will. I am part, Roger is part of energy manifest. And so God's will very often is simply there to counter the false idea of Roger's will.